Okay. Thank you, everyone. Reminding you that for those who are registered, you have an essay to do.
Yeah, we have an essay.
We agreed to 60 pages, single space?
Yes, 60 or 70, we're still discussing. But we'll let you know.
It's particularly important. I give a class, a 3-hour class on how to write essays. And as an editor, I'm very big on the structure, argumentation, but the structure of the essay. And as editor, I can tell you some horror stories. In the last 10 years, I've received a few papers with no sections, no subsections, just 40 pages of text. And so, and I received one article. This is a true story. It was, I did not know the author, but the author was from England, where they speak English. And I start reading, and the first paragraph is kind of long. 2 pages, 3 pages, 4 pages long. It was one paragraph. 40 pages. Yeah. This is a true story. And so structure your essay well, and don't forget that an essay is a question that you're answering. So start with your question and structure your sections according to the answers you want to provide. Just keep that in mind. I pay a lot of attention to the structure. And do you know Robert Heilbronner? Heilbronner.
Old time.
Heilbronner wrote a book called The Worldly Philosophers.
Amazing book.
It is one of the most published and translated books in the world. And it's about the classical authors. And he once told me, he's was a phenomenal writer. And he once told me, don't try to impress people with your writing. Just impress them with your ideas. So when you write, you don't have to use big words and big sentences and big, I went to the store, I went home, I had chips, I passed out. There you go. It gets your ideas across without using, okay? Good luck with that. And don't hesitate to write to me if you want some advice on how to structure your paper. Today we're going to talk about endogenous money. Who has never heard of endogenous money? Okay. So I'll bear that in mind as I go along. And for those who know about it, be patient. Are you masters or PhD students?
We have both here.
What are you? MA? PhD?
So she's an undergrad. Yeah.
Perfect. Oh, excellent. I like that. Okay. So, good. As I said, I collect art from Quebec, and this is from It's Angelina. And on the covers of my book, I often put pictures of art from my collection, of course with the permission of the artist. But if you pick up a book of mine, you'll see that. Okay. So, this is a very famous quote by Joan Robinson. The purpose of studying economics is not to acquire a set of ready-made answers to economic questions, but to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. So you learn about economics in order not to be deceived by the mainstream of the profession. No wonder we didn't give her the Nobel Prize when she says things like that. And this is particularly interesting about the concept of money. I'm not going to talk, I might talk about a little bit about money per se. And I did talk a little bit about it when I talked about the monetary circuit. And my apologies, sometimes I just take into, I assume that students know things, but maybe you don't if you're an undergraduate. But, I did say that money doesn't come from barter. And money arises when a company decides to get into debt towards the banking system. And so in that sense, money, as I said, is the physical manifestation of debt. It is debt that circulates. When you buy something, the act of consumption is the act of settling a debt. When you buy a cake, you have the cake, you now have a debt towards the baker. And you settle that debt by giving him or her money. And that baker has a debt towards the bank. And because of your consumption, that baker can now repay his or her debt. And so money and debt are intrinsically linked. And in fact, money, as what we understand as money, is the result of the relationship between a debtor and the bank. There's a very famous book that was published, I think in 2000, by John Smithen. And John Smithen is a Canadian economist. And he wrote a book called What is Money? And it's got articles from philosophers and from anthropologists and from economists. And it's a very interesting book that delves into the nature of money. Now, if you become professors and you go to conferences and people give talks about money, one of the first questions someone will inevitably ask is, how do you define money? Is money something in my pocket? Or is it a bank deposit? Or is it moneyness? So what's money? How do you define money? And depending on your answer, they say, oh, that's the problem with you because you define money. Okay. So not to mention what is liquidity preference. That's a whole can of worms. But so I define money as, and in that book, What is Money? The best article ever written by Alain Parguez and Mario Sicarici. It is you have to read that article, and they define what is money from a separatist perspective. We talked about Alain Parguez yesterday. And it is a fantastic article. And for me, that article remains very much something that I give all the time to students to read, and how money is a result of a triangular relationship, the bank, the debtor, a little bit with the central bank, as we'll see today. But one of the things that comes out of that discussion, as we explored yesterday, is the fact that money appears out of the needs of the production system. As I said, in mainstream theory, has anyone taught principles of macroeconomics here? Have you taught a class, or when you're an undergraduate student, and you learn about mainstream theory, if you look at a textbook, I've said this yesterday, they talk to you about wages and labor, technology and growth and production and output and investments, prices, without any money. And the whole concept of relative prices is simply to avoid the complication of introducing money. How much is this? Oh, it's worth 2 apples. That's a price. And you're not referring to money. You don't need money. But of course, they introduce money, and if you look at chapter 20 in the textbook, money. All money comes from barter. That's the story. Double coincidence of roots. You know the story. If I want to buy that, and I go, and he goes, I said, I've got chickens. He goes, no, I don't want chickens. I want iPads. I go to her and go, let me buy you an iPad. How many chickens? She goes, well, I don't want any chickens. I want iPhones. And, so I go, she sells iPhones. I want to buy your iPhones. I got, and she goes, no, I don't want chickens. I want, and so prices. They say, oh, prices just make sense. How much is that? $5. Okay. In post-Keynesian economics, we don't live in that world. We don't live in the real economy. We live in a monetary economy. And money is part of a monetary economy of production. In the real economy, I hire you and I pay you in the example of the corn economy in Chicago. I pay you in corn, and you eat corn, and you save corn, and you plant corn, and it grows corn. It's a one commodity world. In a one commodity world, yeah, maybe you don't need money. You eat corn, save corn, you invest corn. But as soon as you leave that one commodity world, then it becomes a money, and you need money. If I hire you, you don't want to be paid in notebooks. You want to be paid in money, because you need money to buy pencils and food. So money is intrinsic to the analysis. And that's very Schumpeterian. In Schumpeter, he defines real analysis proceeds from the principle that all essential phenomena of economic life are capable of being described in terms of goods and services. That's what I said. Labor, wages, all in terms of goods. That's worth 2 apples. Of decisions about them and of relations between them. Money enters the picture only in the modest role of a technical device that has been adopted in order to facilitate transactions. She doesn't want chickens. She wants to be paid an iPhone. She doesn't want chickens. I have to go and then finally he wants chickens, so I buy backpacks, to buy iPhones, to buy iPads, to buy a notebook. It's to facilitate transactions. So long as it functions normally, it does not affect the economic process, which behaves in the same way as it would in a barter economy, right? The veil. This is essentially what the concept of neutral money implies. But he defines a monetary analysis, one that introduces the element of money on the very ground floor of our analytic structure and abandons the idea that all essential features of our economic life can be represented by a barter economy model. And like I said yesterday, if you talk to anthropologists, they'll tell you, oh, there's no such thing as a barter. It was cultural. It was not economic. And certainly not a dominant form of trade. For example, and this concept, you can see in Lavoie's book and my book with Rossi, where, there's Mark begins his book with a discussion of Post-Keynesian, and then gets into theory of choice, and I can't remember what chapter 3 is, micro. Then the first chapter of the macroeconomic part of the book is money. it begins with the discussion of money. And we do the same thing. Chapter 4 of our book as well. Chapter 1 is what is economics. Chapter 2 is the state of macroeconomics. Chapter 3 is a paper by Heinrich Bortis. And then, there you go. We begin the discussion of macro with money. For if you're interested. Do you know Marc Lavoie's book? The 2022 version of his book?
It's the second edition.
It's the second edition of his Post-Keynesian economics book. In the review of Political Economy, by the way, your professor is associate editor of the journal. And in the October issue, we have 8 papers, each paper discussing a chapter of the book. So chapter 1 is a discussion by John King. Chapter 2 is by the Capulus. Chapter 3 is by Rita Canali. Chapter 4 is by myself and Silvio Capis from Brazil. Chapter 5 on effective demand is by Peter Chrysler. Lydia Brochet, chapter 6. Robert Gutmann, chapter 7. And Julia Braga and Franklin Serrano from here, Brazil, is chapter 8. So these are good sort of 5,000 word discussions of the content of each chapter of the book. So I hope you download them. If you follow me on Twitter, at LP Rochon, I often promote the journal, the articles, things like that. Money Endogeneity. So, let me begin first with the mainstream version. In the mainstream, we say that money is exogenous, from outside the system. That system, like I said, labor, wages, you can talk about inflation without money. Oh, the notebook is worth 3 apples now. No need for money. That's the system. And then, oh yeah, let's introduce money. You introduce money, right? Manna from heaven, or the helicopter. You just drop, right? The paper by Phoebe Green-Lavoie is called Helicopter Bands. Yeah, you just drop it. That's vertical money. It's just imposed. Oh, and if you impose too much money, you've got inflation. Okay? So inflation is tied to the amount of money. Milton Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And you still have that today. Tomorrow we'll talk about the new consensus model, and we'll see how inflation is always and everywhere a monetary policy phenomenon. Hence the need for monetary policy to solve inflation. But it's the same concept. And that goes back to the quantity theory of money. Version 1 or version 2, where you have, MV equals PY. And M is money. Y is income. Sorry, MV. V is velocity equals price times income. And the causality runs from left to right. Money to prices. And in the long run, you have, I wish I had a blackboard. In the long run, you have, if you put the quantity of money, if you put it in terms of growth rates, well, the velocity is constant, so that drops, and income growth in equilibrium. There you go, and then you have this type of. So inflation is caused by the growth of money. Hence why Milton Friedman said, well, if you want an inflation of 3%, you have to limit the growth of the money supply to 3%. In the long run, you might have short-run fluctuations, but in the long run, M, growth of M equals the growth of P. So the causality goes from money to income. Nominal income, P1. And so therefore, you have to have a central bank that is able to control the growth of the money supply. And that was the experience during the 1980s with central banks around the world. They tried to control the money supply. It didn't work. We're not going to get into that, but it did work. And that's why you had interest rates explode to 20%. Imagine, we're complaining that interest rates are 5% in Canada right now, or here in Brazil, at how much?
13.75. Maybe tomorrow, today in the evening, we'll have good news, but maybe.
I don't believe in good news when it comes to central banks. I'll talk about this on Friday, but I just want to say, I find it incredible. This concept I've talked about, monetary policy dominance. This idea that only, and it comes from this. Inflation is only caused by excess money. So therefore you need to control money. Or if you replace M dot by monetary policy, interest rates. You need to control interest rates to control inflation. Inflation is only caused by money. And in a way, you still have money, because in the Vixelian model, if the market rate is below the natural rate, that encourages investment and encourages aggregate demand and encourages inflation. So, in the article by Marc Lavoie and Brett Fiebiger, they say this. Marc Lavoie said, it's just old wine in a new bottle. It's the same thing. In the back of their minds, it's still a question of trying to control monetary variables in order to achieve a stable inflation. But what I find, and so this is what they think. This is all what they think. And this is why they raise interest rates. And this is why they will, they believe, sure, it's painful, but it has to be done. I'll have lots to say about that on Friday. But what I find incredible is this idea that it's okay to create unemployment in order to reduce inflation. The idea that you're insignificant. Why, if you're insignificant? Because we can create unemployment and ruin your life. Oh, but as long as inflation is coming down. And it's incredible. And then, when we go to a conference, Naples, by the Bank of Italy, and we say, we have to talk about social power and social class, and they go, oh, how dare you? And I'm going, but the central bankers are telling me, how many companies, and I was having breakfast this morning with Isabella Weber, and we were comparing notes. She says, I have a list of comments by, the president of this company that says, no, we want to protect profits and our shareholders' wealth against workers. And I go, yeah, how? And I don't understand why central banks saying, oh, how dare you talk about class conflict. You guys talk about it every day. You don't use the word class conflict, you say shareholders. And I remember in Naples, the guy said, shareholders are workers, they work. And I go, oh my God. But anyways, you don't know how angry I've become in the last year. And this is what money exogeneity is. It is imposed on the system. And then the idea that we must control the money supply, and as a result, right? When you try to control money, interest rates go up. And that's what happened in the 1980s. And then Nicky Kaldor comes and writes this book, famous book, The Scourge of Monetarism. Monetarism is what we called Milton Friedman. The Scourge of Monetarism. And it was aimed against Margaret Thatcher and her policies of austerity at the Bank of England and etc. If you ever pick up it's a short book, you can read it. It's such a great book by such a great author. So, for reasons that we've explored yesterday, Post-Keynesians reject the concept of money exogeneity. For us, money comes from within the system. The needs of trade. And, from Kaldor, I was looking for this. The needs of production, the needs of trade. We need to produce. So, because money is endogenous, and because of the sequential analysis of production, payment of wages, consumption, and then saving. Savings arises at the end. So it cannot fund investment. In neoclassical theory, savings determines investment. More savings implies more investment. But for post-Keynesians, it's the other way around. Investment determines your savings. Okay, well then what determines investment? Expectations of the growth of aggregate demand in the future. Okay. But how do you undertake investment or production? You need to finance it. You need to get money because you don't have prior savings. You need to get money to buy the machine or to pay workers. So it's through bank debt. It's through credit. And so the emphasis here is on credit. And once a company gets credit and pays workers, money is created. Concept of money creation. So you see, it's a very different story. You cannot talk about production or wages or labor or growth without a concept of money and how it's created and how it circulates. Okay? And so I'll get to this last point in a few more slides. Keynes, an attractive monetary form. And I know what you guys are going to say. You're going to go around and you're going to say, Rochon says, don't quote Keynes anymore. But spend his entire time quoting Keynes. Okay. In attractive monetary form, during the lengthy process of production, it depends on which Keynes you want to quote. During the lengthy process of production, the business world is increasing outgoings in terms of money, paying out in money for wages and other expenses of production, in the expectation, my emphasis, expectation, of recouping the outlay by disposing of the product for money at a later date. So a company doesn't have the revenues to pay. Revenues arrive, if you produce the goods, you pay workers to produce the goods, and then later you sell your goods and get revenue to use to reimburse your debt. There exists a relation between production, credit, and debt. The desire to produce is a willingness to enter into a debt-creditor relationship with banks. Money is the result of debt or the physical manifestation of debt. There you go. Now, and we've looked into the relationship between these Socratists and their analysis of money, and how Kregel said the Socratist is the one who who reinvigorated the study of money. This is a book that was written by Basil Moore in 1988. It is probably the Bible of monetary theory in post-Keynesian economics. 1988, it's been 35 years, and as I said yesterday, I own the rights to the book now, and we're going to reprint the book with Routledge, with a preface by Ulrich Beinsel, who is a very, very high up at the ECB, and a very long introduction by Lavoie and myself. This is, the book is very much in the tradition of Kaldor, and Basil, like I said, this is the book of reference when it comes to monetary theory, monetary policy. Now, the endogenous theory of money is really, the cornerstone of post-Keynesian economics. It is the point of departure. You have to understand money. You have to understand how it is introduced into the economic system to move forward. And everybody, all the founding fathers, mothers, all the post-Keynesians agree on the endogenous nature of money. Now, this said, there was a huge debate that lasted 20 years, which I'll talk about a little bit later, on endogenous money. But for now, we all agree on some sort of version of endogenous money, the idea that money emanates from the needs of production. And so, the title of the book, Horizontalists and Verticalists, is Basil's way of sort of showing a very, graphically, a very different way of expressing money. Whereas the mainstream is a vertical drop, the post-Keynesian is a horizontal drop where, it's a demand for credit that generates from within the system. And so graphically, I'll have the graph and I'll show the graph, but, the money supply curve, if you want, is horizontal, not vertical or not upward sloping, horizontal. I have a few things to say about that. But in contrast with the verticalists, so John King, in his review, but in 2002, I wonder if for something I published probably, calls Moore's book, The Definitive Defense of Horizontalism, of post-Keynesian economics. Okay. So like I said, it's a rejection of Say's law. Production needs to be financed. By whom? And that's a good question. Who will finance the production? For post-Keynesians, these are banks. Keynes tells us banks are special. Banks are able to create money. And so it's done through banks. And this is the quote that's at the bottom of my email. Credit is a pavement along which production travels, right? If you want to produce, you need bank credit to pay workers, to buy materials. And if bankers knew their duty would provide the transport facilities to just the extent that is needed to get to full employment. And, this is an old story. Philip Orestes, who knows the name of Philip Orestes? Who knows the name of Philip Orestes? Okay. So we talked about him yesterday. He is the one that I think is responsible for creating the institution post-Keynesian economics in the United Kingdom. He tells us with a paper by Eichner. The amount of funds in circulation depends on the amount of loans made by bank and thus on demand for credit. Okay? Now, in mainstream theory, I'll get to that in a little more, but I just want to say the process, it's a very different theory of that. Let me get to that later. And then the central banks just sets the rate of interest. And here the rate of interest is what I would call an administrative price. They set the interest rate. And central banks, Keynes tells us, central banks can have any rate of interest rate. Tonight, the central bank can bring the interest rate to 1%. They could do that. There would be consequences. But that's another question. Can the Central Bank of Brazil lower interest rate to 1%? Yes. I hate to see the consequences, but they can. So it's an administrative price. And then that rate of interest, look at the new consensus model, which we'll discuss tomorrow. The rate of interest depends on the inflation term, as we see today. So the central bank decides, it's not a market mechanism. It's not like we wake up this morning and go, oh, the rate of interest went up. What happened? Oh, it's because the market is, no. It's the central bank decides. We increase the rate of interest. And for the record, I believe that central banks always did that, even during the Friedmanian years. Today, they're just a lot more transparent about that. But I think this is what they were really doing also. They had to, because if I believe the interest rates are administered, then they were doing that. They kept raising interest rates during those years up to 20% in order to combat inflation. Now, this said, yeah, so it's an administrative price. Like companies when they set the price of apples. These are not market determined prices. They set. And it's the same thing with the central bank. And so what you have at the end of the day is this. So this is sort of the post-Keynesian interpretation. So you have your credit market, interest rate credit. Or this could just well be the ISLN model. David Romer wrote a paper in 2000 called Monetary Policy Without the LM Curve. It's a great little paper, where he adopts this model. And I remember writing to him and said, for sake, post-Keynesians have been saying this since 1970. Could you just have put a reference in there? A footnote would have been great. Now, I'm not going to get into a debate over the ISLM model, right? But if you say, but I don't like the model. I hate the ISLM model for whatever reasons. But I like the model for teaching purposes. And the reason is, if you have if this is IS and LM, you can easily have an IS curve that's very inelastic. We'll see tomorrow that the new consensus of mainstream model requires an elastic IS curve. When you raise your interest rate, you have to have that impact on output, which is the first equation of the new consensus model. If monetary policy does not affect output, you're in trouble. But for post-Keynesians, the IS curve is rather inelastic. At low interest rates, nothing was happening. Because investment doesn't depend on interest rates, maybe a little bit. But the LM curve is if you use it as a pedagogical device, a horizontal LM curve has a really nice implication. Because if government spends, your IS curve is shifting out, nothing happens to interest rates. So you break that relationship between fiscal policy and interest rates. How many times do we hear, oh, government deficits lead to higher interest rates? You see that in newspapers all the time. with this IS curve, ISLN curves. You can have deficits and nothing happens. Now, maybe the central bank will decide to raise interest rates, but certainly not based on fiscal deficits, probably on, but it's an interesting sort of pedagogical sort of analysis. And you have the opportunity of reading Romer's really nice article on this. Oh, and by the way, when I wrote to Romer, I said, couldn't you have, he didn't reply. Okay. So we established the fact that money is endogenous. It responds to the needs of trade, the needs of production. Firms need to finance production, wages. And that involves banks. And so the endogenous nature of money, Sergio Rossi doesn't like the expression endogenous money. He refers to money's endogeneity. A little bit subtle. But for him and for me, money is always endogenous. Because as soon as a bank decides to give credit, money is created. And so, in circuit articles, you always read the nature of money. So money by its nature is endogenous. And so in my story, like I said yesterday, there was no central banks. You don't need central banks to explain the endogeneity of money. And that led to part of that debate that I was talking, and I'll talk about that. But here is sort of the two poles of endogeneity, and this brings in the central bank. So the first pole is the relationship between banks and bank borrowers. And this is what the securitists have emphasized. You won't see a lot of analysis of central banks by securitists. But it's a relationship between banks and bank borrowers. And there's a rejection of the money multiplier model. In mainstream theory, the process begins with maybe an open market operation, which gives banks deposits or reserves, and then finally banks can lend. So banks are constrained by the availability of deposits. That's the money multiplier model. And in many respects, the financial crisis was based on that. Quantitative easing was based on the idea that, bank interest rates are zero. Why are they not lending? Oh, it's because they're lacking reserves. So let's have quantitative easing. Let's give banks lots of funds, and they'll be able to lend. And this was the official position of the Bank of England. Okay. Now, in Rope, I published in 2023, I think, a wonderful paper by Irene Illig from the Federal Reserve, based on, she had published a sort of a research paper at the Fed called Rest in Peace Multiplier Model. And so I contacted her, I said, I want that paper. So she wrote another version, where the money multiplier model doesn't exist. That's just not how it works. And so for the post-Keynesians, we take that into consideration. Banks are never constrained by a lack of deposits or lack of reserves. Okay, keep that in mind. So there's that relationship. Banks can lend as much as they want. And we'll get into, just a second, we'll get into bank lending. But that's sort of and then in that relationship, money is demanded. Credit, Basel's expression is demand determined. Money is demand determined. It is the result of a demand for credit, which is about the first pole of Endogeneity. The second pole is about the relationship between banks and the central bank, which has been the focus of post-Keynesian economists. Post-Keynesians don't talk much about the first, but a lot about the second. And this has led to some debate and some misunderstanding, and I'll explain that in a second. But even with that relationship, the demand for reserves, high-powered money, is also demand determined. It's what banks need. And so that has led to the expression in Basil Moore that loans create deposits and the deposits create reserves. Now, reserves is a residual, and in my opinion, not very important in the story. But they are not causal. In mainstream theory, reserves are causal. They cause the system. And in post-Keynesian, they are the result of the system. And the reason I say they're not as important is because in Canada, the central bank has eliminated reserves. In England, in Australia, and in many countries around the world, reserves don't exist. We don't even call them reserves. We call them what they are: settlement balances. They are meant to settle debt between banks on the books of the central bank. Bank A owes Bank B. How do they settle that? Well, through transfers of Bank A's account at the central bank to the account of Bank B. And that's what they are. Now, banks still have, even though we've eliminated reserves in Canada, banks still have settlement balances on their accounts at the central bank because they use them to settle, but they don't need. And when the central banks don't use the reserve ratio to manipulate policy, it's just not how it's done.
Sorry, how is that you call this in Canada?
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't call reserves anymore? How is that you call? You mentioned the expression.
Settlement balances.
Settlement balance.
Settlement balances, and you see that at the Bank of England too, and a lot of other central banks, they call them settlement balances. Yes. And I remember I gave a paper. Well, it's funny because I gave a paper, I can't remember where it was, and this man in the audience says, "Oh, that makes so much more sense now. If you call them settlement, yeah, that's what they do, you know." So, yeah. So, you know, if I buy apples at this store using my card, I settle my debt, and my bank transfers the money to his bank. Sorry. How would that work? Yeah, so I buy the apples. And then later on, his bank says to my bank, "Hey, you need to give me that money." So the act of consumption implies two debts: the debt I have with him for the apples and the debt between our two banks. Now, if there's only one bank, it's not one. But if you have several banks, and historically, I don't know, when do banks close in Brazil? Time.
No. You mean the banks,
Yeah.
the branches? Yeah, 9 to 5.
Okay. I remember in Canada, banks used to close at 3 o'clock. And that historically, that's because, well, they needed time to settle their accounts and figure out, you know. And today computers are so fast, it's done in a second. But yeah, they need to settle. So it involves two debts: my debt and the bank's debt. And again, debt when money is created, debt when I'm trying to buy something, debt between the banks, right? So the concept of debt in a monetary economy is very important. And so that relationship between banks and the central banks, because at the end of the day, money is credit-driven, demand-determined at both poles. Okay? And this goes back, this is Holmes. This is a paper that Lavoie likes to quote. He's a central banker, and he wrote, "In the real world, banks extend credit, creating deposits in the process, and look for the reserves later." When you go to a bank and you borrow money for a card, the guy doesn't say, "Oh, wait, let me call the reserve department to see if we have enough loan." Right? They just give you that. Or maybe not. If you're lucky, they'll give you that loan, you can buy a car. And then the bank. And I think that there's a lot of that story now filtering through the research at central banks. The Bank of England. There's a lot at the Bundesbank. There's a lot. The Bundesbank, a very conservative bank, they have a research paper on endogenous money, on this type of mechanism. Like I said, the ECB and Ulrich Beinzell, very, very high up at the ECB. I invite him many times at conferences. And, he's always saying, "Yeah, of course, of course." And Ulrich wrote in 2013 in the Review of Keynesian Economics, I published a symposium in honor of the 25th anniversary of the book by Basil Moore. And Ulrich's article was that, Basil was right. This is how it works. And the book is even more relevant today. And that's why Lavoie and I are going to reprint it. Alfred Eichner. He writes, "The change in the Fed's holdings of government securities and thus its open market operation is endogenously determined by the need to maintain," he's talking about that relationship between banks and central banks. Banks create loans and look for reserves later, which they will borrow in the interbank market or from the central bank directly. And what Eichner is saying here is, and if central banks refuse, they can create a crisis. We saw what happened in 2007 when the interbank market in Europe froze. If a bank is not able to borrow, because at the end of the day, a bank may be in deficit position towards the banking system and if it can't borrow, we're in trouble. We saw this during COVID. Pumped liquidity into the banking system. And so Eichner, in his famous book in 1987, from which this is taken, he talks about the defensive behavior of central banks. Central banks are always on the defense. They react to everything. I'll get to that in a second. But here he says, if they don't meet the needs of banks, they can create a crisis. It is an error to assume that the monetary base or high-powered money is an exogenously determined policy variable. So by constantly reacting, etc., by meeting the needs, etc., money at that pole is also, high-powered money is endogenous. Money is endogenous, the first pole. High-powered money is endogenous through the second pole. So all money inside or high-powered is endogenous. And again, completely different view. So Eichner defines two types of behavior from the central bank. One that he calls accommodative, and the other one is called defensive. Now, Eichner is not known for his monetary writings on money and banks. When I was an undergraduate student, however, and Lavoie is a big fan of Eichner's. As I said, we edited a book in his honor. Lavoie would give not just the chapters of that book, but Eichner had a couple of papers on money in '85 before the book. But I always thought Eichner was a monetary economist. Eichner is primarily a microeconomist on market pricing. But I always viewed him as a monetary economist because that's how he was introduced to me. And I wrote a couple of papers on the defensive and accommodative nature of central banks. Accommodative behavior in central bank is a traditional post-Keynesian role attributed to central banks. In this context, the central bank agrees to supply reserves incurred as a result of increases in commercial bank loans or credit. If you increase bank loans, you increase your deposits, you increase your need for reserves. As a result, commercial banks are in need of reserves. Typically, they will turn to the central bank and borrow these reserves, which the central bank accommodates. The accommodative nature. But however, the defensive component is that each transaction modifies the liquidity position of each bank through consumption, or in a MMT version, through taxes. If you collect taxes, you're withdrawing funds from the market. If you're spending, the government injects funds into the market, and that will have an impact on the interest rate, right? That interest rate that the Central Bank of Brazil will set at 14% tonight, that's the target interest rate. There's also a market interest rate. And I don't know Brazil, but in Canada, that market interest rate, Canada is 5%, that market interest rate every day is 4.99, 5.01. And what happens in Canada, the central bank will interfere throughout the day. Oh, there's too much liquidity in the banking system. It's pushing the interest rate down. And the central bank will get into repos or reverse repos or use government. You know what a repo is? It's a repurchase agreement. So I will sell you a government bond with the promise of buying it tomorrow. Or a reverse repo, I will buy it today with the promise of selling it back to you tomorrow. It's a way of draining any excess or any, what's the opposite word of excess? Shortage of liquidity, thank you, in the banking system. So if there's too much liquidity and the interest rate start going down away from the target, the central bank will withdraw, drain, thank you, just for the day. And they do this every day. And one thing also that we do is the central bank will transfer government deposits from its account, the government's account in the central bank, to accounts at the various banks, or take money out. And they do that just mechanically. They're, oh, too much money, let's trade some. Oh, too much money, let's inject. And that's the defensive nature of central banks. The defensive role, which he defines as the component of the Fed's open market operations to find repos, reverse repos, government deposits, consistent of buying or selling of government securities so that on net balance, it offsets the flows in and out of the monetary financial system. In other words, the central bank may just well be the most activist institution. And that, I'm sure, makes a lot of right-wing, conservative, mainstream people really upset. I know, I've told them, oh, come on, central banks are super activists. How dare you say that? Well, come on. They intervene constantly in markets. Okay. And the defensive role is not something that's emphasized by the mainstream, even today. But the accommodative behavior, so their view of central banks is the lender of last resort. It's sort of this. The banks need reserves, a bank will act as a lender of last resort. And we saw this during the crisis and COVID, where the European Central Bank said, oh, we are acting as lenders of last resort. Sort of we call that the fireman role. There's a fire, central bank comes in, puts out the fire by injecting liquidity. But this is important for post-Keynesians, absolutely. This, for me, is even more important. And this has to do with monetary policy implementation, for example. Silvio Capis, I think my name is on the book, I'm not sure. Who here knows Silvio Capis? The name of Capis? So he's a Brazilian, somewhere north here. And we publish a lot of books together. You should look him up, K-A-P-P-E-S. And we're doing a book on monetary policy implementation. 20 chapters, I think, from around the world. People from around the world describing how their central banks implement monetary policy. And this is part of the story. The interest rate that they announce is only a target interest rate. Central banks must be able to enforce that interest rate. And how do they do that? Well, through various activities. So if anyone is interested in this, it's a very interesting line of inquiry. So central banks are, as I said, the activists. They meet the day-to-day needs of the banking system and want to neutralize. Lavoie is really big on the neutralization of flows into the banking system, even in an open economy. Okay? And Basil Moore in 1988 wrote this. By far, the bulk of the central bank's open market operations involve continuously injecting into or withdrawing funds from the wholesale market defensively in response to changes in net inflows and outflows of funds as to maintain the depth of liquidity of these financial markets. I would just replace the last part just to say, as to maintain the rate of interest on target. Okay? And in a very early paper by Lavoie, he says the same thing. The central bank must comply with decisions taken and the environment created by commercial banks. If they don't, it may lose whatever control it has on financial operations. Okay? And, Basil is very famous for having said, post-Keynesians rank the financial stability of the system above all things. That's why central banks were created. To regulate the financial stability. When the Silicon Valley Bank, there's another bank that went bankrupt this week, by the way, in the United States. But, so this is not over. These are small banks, but they're not over. Silicon Valley was big because those small regional banks account for 50% of mortgages. So it's, or more, I think I read. And so, the big question is when these banks were starting to go bankrupt, what would the central bank choose? Would they choose to try to regulate the financial stability of the banking system? Luckily, it didn't lead to a massive problem, but it could have, and then we would have had a repeat of the financial crisis. Okay. Okay. So here we're going to talk a little bit about, so what the, sort of a summary of what the endogenous money means. And I called this in my book, in a 1999 book, the revolutionary theory of endogenous money. And I don't know why. At the time, the revolution, again, it was meant to be sort of the horizontalist version. Because we'll see that the debate within the post-Keynesians, which lasted 20 years, was a very difficult debate. So for me, the revolutionary theory of money endogeneity involves A, the reverse causality between money and income. Remember, the quantity theory of money is from left to right, from money to income. And Joan Robinson once said, well, if at least in 1970, I think she says, if at least we had read the equation the other way around, it wouldn't have been that bad. The idea that income, the need to create income, the need to create production and pay wages involves bank loans that create money in the process. But we need to reverse the causality of the quantity theory of money. And she said that as early as 1956. Look at that, I'm not surprised. Reverse causality between reserves, deposits, and loans. Like I said, loans create deposits, which creates reserves. High-powered, I wish I had not used the word reserves back then, but I guess I didn't know better. Reserves are endogenous and have no causal influence on loans. Reverse causality between savings and investment. These are all components of endogenous money. Because if you have savings determining investment, you don't need bank loans. You need an accumulation of savings. So as soon as you want to speak about endogenous money, you need to reverse that causality. You need to have an exogenous base rate of interest determined by the central bank administratively and not by market mechanisms of supply and demand schedules of something or another. And that the money supply is demand determined and credit driven. And money is primarily a flow. Another big characteristic difference between the mainstream, where they see, of course, if you just impose your money stock, it's a stock. It's a stock of money. And the question of rationing comes in, because if you have a stock of money, you have to ration it. But there's no questions of rationing in post-Keynesian economics. And as I'll see, when people like Vicky Chick and Sheila Dow talked about credit rationing, I don't think they have understood the expression. Rationing implies a limited supply. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Implications. You have to reject the natural rate of interest. You cannot have a theory of endogenous money if you have a natural rate of interest. Wicksell does not have endogenous money. And that always creates a lot of anger when I say that, because everyone thinks Wicksell had endogenous. But there you go. Wicksell had a natural rate of interest. And that natural rate of interest acts as a center of gravitation, right? The market interest rate gravitates, right? It's about convergence and stability. If your market rate equals your natural rate, your system is stable. Right? The rejection of the natural rate of interest is shared by many post-Keynesians. John Smith, and I mentioned Marc Lavoie, Marius Echeverria, and Colin Rogers, who wrote a very nice book in 1989 on the natural rate of interest. He's Australian. This is an attempt to differentiate. Oh yeah, because it differentiates post-Keynesian theory from sort of orthodox theories of endogenous money. For example, the Wickelsian theory. As soon as you reject the natural rate of interest, you reject sort of these. And I've always said that, I remember when new consensus models, which we'll explore tomorrow, start to get sort of popular. I remember some post-Keynesians were saying, look, the mainstream are adopting endogenous money. And I'm going, that's not endogenous money. They still have a natural rate of interest. They might have endogenized the money a little bit, but it's not endogenous money. Maybe it's semantics. But Keynes specifically rejects the natural rate of interest. I'm no longer of the opinion, right? So this is book 7 is the general theory. And here I'm no longer of the opinion because in the treatise, Keynes was still defending the natural rate. I'm no longer of the opinion that the concept of a natural rate of interest, which previously seemed to me as the most promising idea, has anything very useful or significant to contribute to our analysis. Colin Rogers, the existence of money is therefore not sufficient to generate post-Keynesian results, although it's necessary. The classic and market forces required to determine the natural rate of interest simply do not exist or cannot interact in such a way as to generate the optimum or natural rate. I remember I was in Kansas City at a conference, a post-Keynesian MMT conference. And the guy there, who's the banker, the Bank of England, he wrote a paper called Is More True Horizontalists? Famous Goodart, thank you. Charles Goodart was there. He's a central banker. I asked him, and I asked him, I said, how do you determine the natural rate? And he was really embarrassed. He goes, well, we can't. We just assume it exists. But it's a pretty strong assumption when modern, contemporary monetary policy is based on the assumption of something that doesn't exist. Well, if there's inflation, we know that the market rate must be below the natural rate. So that's why we need to increase it. That's completely Wickselian. Lavoie, from that 1996 paper that I mentioned. Those post-Keynesian or institutionalist authors who claim to be describing monetary production economies are implicitly defining models where the natural rate of interest is irrelevant. To define the proper foundations of the post-Keynesian monetary analysis, one must thus simultaneously and explicitly adopt an endogenous money approach and discard the notion of a natural rate of interest. And so, as soon as you do that, a big question that remains is, what do you do about inflation? The mainstream, it's inflation is always everywhere, monetary or monetary policy. But if you have endogenous money, if you have a system where money, the growth of money, money grows with the needs of production, you can never have excess money in your system. So you break the link between money and inflation. Perfect. Any questions? We'll stop here for the first half. Any questions so far? I'll have more to say about inflation on Friday. But it's a big debate amongst post-Keynesians right now. You know, we've had no inflation, I don't mean Brazil, but in Canada, US, Europe, we've had no inflation for 40 years. And now it's come back, and I can tell you, I've been having almost daily emails with Marc Lavoie and Mario Sequeira on inflation and monetary policy. Every day for the past year. And we have some disagreements. And so it's a big controversy. I'll have something to say about, but we agree on this. We agree that it has nothing to do with monetary policy. But we have some disagreements, yes.
You say it could just be a matter of semantics, but you say that can we also understand like the Wickselian vision in a matter of time? Like, would you understand that he had a understanding of endogenous money in the short term? But the long term, no, there is this force driven to it.
And I don't know how you can differentiate it, because the very core of your model, even in the short run, your interest rate or market rate tends towards, right, your long run is independent. Your natural rate of interest is independent of your market rate. It's determined by productivity and thrift. So your market rate tends towards that, right? For post-Keynesians, if we were to talk about a natural or a long-run interest rate, we would say that long-run interest rate depends on the current interest rate because of some sort of path dependency, or certainly is not independent of what's happening in markets. So, it's funny, in the paper I wrote with Mark Setterfield, I asked that question. I said, if we reject the natural rate of interest, then what? And this is what we tried to do with the Pasinetti rule and the Kansas City rule and the Pasinetti rule. Versions of longer rates of interests where you set. So the Kansas City rule believes that the Kansas City rule argues that the nominal interest rate should be zero. Always leave the nominal rate at zero. The Smithian rule, named after John Smithian, he was very happy when the rule was called, but he believed that the real interest rate should always be zero. Pasinetti rule, defended by Lavoie, Sekereccia, and Sausage, believed that the real rate of interest should be equal to the growth of real wages, such that the distribution between rentiers and workers remain fixed from a monetary policy perspective. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Whereas it's clear if you set the nominal rate, and so for John Smith, the real rate of zero means rentier wealth stops growing. With Pasinetti rule, it still grows, but at the same rate as wages. So you leave that functional distribution intact from a monetary perspective. Whereas if you have a nominal rate of zero, that's the euthanasia of the rentier, chapter 24 of Keynes. Rentier income falls, diminishes, decreases. So these are long-run rules. That was my attempt at answering the question, what is the long-run rule in post-Keynesian economics? Yeah. Any other questions? I'm just, brain's kind of jumping, asking myself questions. Okay, any other questions? Yes.
It's more how do we organize the ideas? So, looking in a line, we say that the endogenous money, the money is created by the debit, so we should not be limited by the quantity of money in the system. As it is created inside the system. So, on the other side, when we have the mainstream ideas, why do they don't believe in that?
Joe Robinson had a great expression, and I read it somewhere, and for 25 years I tried to find it again, and I can't find where. But she says, I'm sure she says at one time, what happens if you're a student, you have to learn mainstream theories because you need to do your exams, pass your exams, and when you're a PhD student, you need to learn mainstream theories because you want your dissertation accepted. And once you're a young professor, if you want to get a good job in a good university, you need to know mainstream theories. And if you want to get tenured, you need to know mainstream theories. And if you want to get published in good journals, you need to know mainstream theories. And at the end of the day, that's the only thing you know. Because you spend, all your life. And those who are thinking of a Nobel Prize, you have to have mainstream theories. So there is institutional pressure. I'm never going to earn the Nobel Prize. neither will she, neither will Lavoie, neither did Joan Robbins,
Neither did Paul Davidson.
neither
Really-
would Paul
really worked
Davidson,
it.
yeah, absolutely. And so, I think that's your answer. These people, I think there's institutional pressure to publish mainstream papers and to be mainstream. And then on top of that, it's really the only thing you know. Interestingly enough, in my opinion, those mainstream people that are right, Machiavelli refers to them as dissenters, are the people who won the Nobel Prize, like Stiglitz. He's got nothing left. You know, he's won the Nobel Prize. He did tell me once, he goes, but you know what? His phone doesn't ring anymore. The White House doesn't call him anymore. So does Krugman. So as long as you know, for those people who are a little bit critical, it's a fine line. You want to be critical and say, oh, look, we just went through a financial crisis or a COVID crisis, and look at me. I'm a deep thinker. I'm thinking about what went wrong. But you can't be too critical, because then you'll just be completely rejected by the mainstream. Stiglitz doesn't have that reputation anymore.
Here in Brazil, is Umbrella Rezende to creator of Real Plan, and he was next to the mainstream economics, and today he have ideas next to my ideas, and he is rejected. Of your friends, friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, but these people are honest intellectuals. And that's not rewarded. You're being honest, very good. No, you're being honest, kick you out. And it's unfortunate, but I hope that answers your question.
It's more like an inertia of things.
Sorry?
It's more like an inertia of things.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, the game you have to play for basically your whole life, so.
Yeah.
Which-
Now, I never played that game. I did what I wanted. Always. I published what I wanted, where I wanted. But now, my university declared bankruptcy. We're a little bit better now. But anyways, I'm looking to move. No. Leeds, Gary Dimsky tried to create a position for me at Leeds. He tried to create a position for Amitabh Dutt. It was the same thing. Look, you guys don't have good published papers. It's not in those top journals. I have a friend of mine. She knows me. She's been my friend for 25 years at University of British Columbia. There was an opening there last year, and I applied. She wrote to me. She goes, "Why are you applying for the position of macroeconomics?" I go, "What do you mean? You're not an economist." I go, "Of course I'm an economist." She goes, "Really? I thought you were a sociologist or something." You see, and she knows me. We've had discussions about economics. I know the woman. So, yeah. You have to play that game if you want. And the young people are doing it. They're doing all these models that I don't understand, that I can't follow. You're doing it because you want to try to get published or in a little bit better, journals and something like that, or maybe, But it's interesting because in Naples at the Bank of Italy, my paper was done with two other authors, the young Silvio Capes and someone else. And the other person was like, seriously, did these VAR models, tests, and things that I don't understand. But interestingly enough, when Mario Sequeira presented his paper, there was a lot of anger because it was on functional distribution of income, but no one understood the paper. I told the story of when I presented the paper at the Bank of England. They didn't understand it. But the paper that I presented in Naples with VAR models, I didn't present that part, but Silvio did. We had great conversation with the people from the BIS and from the ECB, and they go, oh yeah, and they liked it. They understood it. Oh yeah, I see what you tried to do. Yeah. I'm going, I don't get it. But anyways, and what I find is I am in sort of awe of the young generation today because you're so technical, many of you. And you'll be able to present papers. I get invited to central banks and I give papers and there's some discussions, I really I think the people who say I don't understand you, they're playing the game. They're playing a game. Because, come on, you know what I'm talking about. Everyone here understood what I said. Tomorrow when I talk about monetary policy and income distribution, it's going to be in English. And you're going to understand it. So why did the Bank of England say, oh, I don't understand it? And, I convinced them to have a conference on that. And they did have a conference, and I see the program. And I contact the guy, I go, why didn't you invite me? It was my idea. He goes, I don't understand what you do. And the reaction we got from the chief economist of the Bank of Italy saying, we would never hire you here. Here we are, they're talking about personal income distribution. We come down and say, oh, but there are gender effects and there are race effects and there's social class and class conflict. And I'm sure they were going, I'm sure they were thinking, I'm sure. So it's a very different sort of approach. But to go back to your question, yeah, there's all sorts of pressure, all sorts to play the game, to do proper research, to do, if you don't have a DSG model, you go. In Naples, we have a VAR model. Don't ask me, I can just repeat the words. I know a little bit what they mean, kidding, but one question was, I really liked your VAR model, but it would have been better if you had a, DSG model instead. That they would have understood a little bit better. Any other questions? Yes.
I see the link between debt and money for post-Keynesian economics, but I was asking myself if capitalism is a consensus in the post-Keynesian.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the only relevant thing about chartalism or cartalism, and both are used, is just the idea that the state defines what that money, what the token is. I think that's it. I think that's pretty much it. The idea that the state can decide tomorrow morning to change currency in Brazil with the US dollar, God forbid. But, and how do you impose it? Through taxes. You can only pay your taxes with US dollar. Then, of course, everyone will have to, you'll say, I must be paid in US dollars. And companies will say, you have to buy my products with US dollars. And then you have the whole system changing into US dollars. I think that's fine. But I think it's just a point of departure. I don't think much more of that. Okay, I think it's time. It is time. In the beginning. Okay, so just to summarize, the core of endogenous money is the role of banks. And so, if banks are not able to lend, or if banks don't want to lend, there could be a very serious crisis. And so, like I said yesterday when I discussed the monetary circuit, it begins with a bank loan, goes through the process, sequence of events. And if there's too much savings in the system, right? I mean, this is the fallacy of composition. If I save a little bit of money, that's good for me. If we save too much money, the firms are not able to, Borges used to say, to capture that effective demand and reimburse their debt. And if there's too indebted towards the banking system at the end, the firms are not able to reimburse all their debt, then the banks might turn around and say, well, we're not going to lend to you anymore. And if they do that to many firms, then they all have to lay people off, unemployment goes up. So it's the concept of, in addition to Minsky, it's the concept, not only firms become more riskier in their behavior, but we emphasize, and I completely agree with that, but another source is the inability to secure funding for production purposes. And so I wrote a paper in 2006, I think, in a book edited by Mark Setterfield from the New School. And it was especially a book in honor of Basil Moore. And I wrote a chapter because what I argued in that chapter, and you have it in your reading list, Post-Keynesians do not have a micro theory of bank lending. Yes, we all agree that banks are important, bank credit is important, and credit is the pavement along which production travels, we all agree with that, and banks provide that, and I think that we all argue, and that led to great debate in post-Keynesian, because the impression was, oh, the horizontalists, like Basil Moore and Louis-Philippe Rochon, they have no theory of banks. They assume banks just give credit to everybody, and we never said that. So this article was written as a way to sort of develop a micro theory of bank lending. I'm writing a paper right now with a Brazilian from Belém called, what is he called? Douglas Alan Carr from Belém. He's a new editor of a journal there that's called Quadernos, I think. Yeah. And I'm on the editorial board, so I should know. But we're writing a paper on that because he did a lot of work, contract work for banks on that question. And I think today I just emailed him and I said, maybe we should do a little mini symposium. The interesting thing of having a journal, we can do whatever we want. Here I am, I said, hey, we should do a mini symposium on that. Let's just do it. And we can do it. And I think we're going to have a call for papers and ask for people to propose a micro theory of bank lending. Yes?
What do you say about my micro banking theory? Do you mean how banks operate in real world about the several factors?
What I mean is, how do banks decide who gets a loan?
Okay, that's what.
And so I think we're going to try to do a mini symposium on that. So that article was sort of a way of filling up that black box. And in English, a black box means it's not clear. It's not clear. The stuff missing. So I tried to do that. And so in this chapter on micro theory of bank lending, I rely on some expressions by Keynes. And Keynes and Barter. So Isaac Barguez, as I mentioned yesterday, he used to say that banks validate the production plans of firms. So I said that the first phase of the monetary circuit, and I want to say one thing to you. You know, it's difficult for me, not always clear to me, where circuit theory begins and where post-Keynesian begins, because I was an undergraduate with Mark Lavoie, who was a post-Keynesian and circulationist, so I was learning all of those things. You know, for me, I just talk about the post-Keynesian view. When I fully realize sometimes it might be more separatist, but nevertheless, I said yesterday, I said yesterday that the first phase is when firms make their production plan. They try to figure out, we have to produce cakes, how many cakes? And that depends on what you expect aggregate demand to be. How much do you think? I'm not going to produce 1 million cakes a day. I'm not going to sell 1 million. How many am I going to produce? And depending on that, and depending on your technology, how many workers are you going to hire to make cakes and run the machines? And then once you figure that out, you have an idea of how much money you need to borrow. But what you're doing is the firm is making a bet. And this is what Alain would say. You're betting on aggregate demand. You're betting on your expectations that you're right. And if you're wrong, you're going to lose money. So, or you're not going to make enough cake, but you might lose money. And then you won't be able to pay the bank and you'll go bankrupt. So you're betting on yourself. You're betting on your expectations. And the bank, if they give you the money, they validate your expectations. They say, yeah, you're right. We agree with you. But the banks also make a bet. Because the bank is going to lend you money if the bank thinks that there's going to be effective demand and you're going to be able to sell your cake. And the banks, and Keynes says this about firms, but I apply it to banks, the banks will operate according to Keynes' bursts of optimism and pessimism. And funny enough, when some central banks do surveys, and the Fed does it, Bank of Canada, Bank of England, and they contact companies, and they say, you know, how optimistic are you about the coming year? And you can get that data. And I always wanted sort of to build the data, to build a model with that, to use that data, to regress it on loans and how that. And the firms will say, oh, no, we are optimistic. We're more pessimistic. And banks, for me, if they're optimistic, I'll give you money. I'll give you a loan because I'm optimistic about the growth of effective demand. And if there's growth in effective demand, I know you'll be able to sell your cakes. But if the banks are pessimistic, they're not going to lend as much. And so, for me, it's uncertainty. It's the role of uncertainty. In a world of uncertainty, production and bank credit depends on expectations and depends on your optimism and pessimism. And in a way, it depends on the relative optimism and pessimism of banks versus those of firms. You can be a firm and go into the bank and go, I'm very optimistic. And the bank says, we're not. So it's the bet of banks versus the bet of firms. And if banks are more pessimistic than borrowers, there's going to be a decline in credit. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean that everyone will get credit. A lot of people won't get credit. And Keynes said to us in the treatise, he says, there will always be a fringe of unsatisfied borrowers. Is that what he said? Where is the quote? Maybe on the other one. A fringe there's a fringe of it's on a fringe of unsatisfied customers. Okay? So there are people that you get a loan, you don't. And the question is, why? And that's what I try to answer. And so, Post-Keynesians will agree that banks always lend to those who are credit worthy. So it's not the demand for credit, it is the credit worthy demand for credit. That's what Mark Lavoie calls it. There's a wonderful paper by Marty Wolfson in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics in '96. He was the first sort of to talk about that. Basil talked about that in that book, by the way. I have a quote in the next slide. I love being able to see the next slide. But it's a creditworthiness. If you're credit worthy, you get a loan. But there's nothing in the post-Keynesian literature that defines creditworthiness. And so I tried to define it in this paper. And so I developed, so the expectations of the firms against those of the banks, as long as the expectations of the banks are at least as optimistic as those of the firms, credit will be given to firms and production will begin. And so what happens is, if there's too much savings in the system, and it's a drain on the revenues of firms, and firms are unable to pay back their full debt, banks might go, oh, I'm not as optimistic as I used to be, so I'm not going to give you, and I'm not going to renew your loan, or I might call in your line of credit. And we saw that during the crisis of 2007 and 8, banks calling in lines of credit. So you're just unable to access your line of credit, and you can't pay your workers. Okay? So when I talk about bank loan, it's often in the form of a line of credit. Okay? You have a line of credit.
Yeah.
And so,
Very expensive.
yeah. And so I don't use my line of credit, but I'm going to do some renovations at the house now, and yeah, I'm going to use my line of credit. But if I didn't have my line of credit, I couldn't. I would have to get a loan, and maybe the bank would say, now's not a good time to do renovations, and your university, we're a little bit pessimistic about you. And this is what I tried to develop. The micro uncertainty and the macro uncertainty. The macro uncertainty is the bank's expectations of aggregate demand next year. The economy, the macro economy. Oh, we think the economy is going to grow. That's the macro uncertain environment. How optimistic are banks about the prospects of growth of effective demand in the future? The micro uncertainty is how are banks optimistic about you? Oh, you just lost your job. Oh, your university just declared bankruptcy. You're going to lose your job? Let's wait to see if you lose your job or not. Then we might lend to you. Or it might be, as a company, you weren't able to reimburse all of your debts. What was wrong? And so, that's why banks ask you to present to them a plan to see, okay, well, maybe if you restructured your company, maybe if you fired a few people, we'd be more optimistic and we'll get, okay? That's the micro uncertainty. It involves the bank's assessment of the creditworthiness of you. And this is the bank's assessment of the creditworthiness of the economy. And what banks will do is they will set a minimum level of criteria that you need to meet in order to get along. And at good times, when the banks are really optimistic and the macro uncertainty is very low or very positive, because those criteria, the criteria you need to meet to get a loan will be very low, because the bank thinks that everyone will be able to reimburse. But as the economy slows down or as there's a crisis, it becomes more difficult to meet the criteria of the bank. And then whereas you were a perfect candidate last year and nothing's changed for you, but the macro uncertainty became more volatile and those criteria suddenly you don't qualify anymore. So we're going to pull your line of credit, or we're not going to renew your loan. And so this work that I'm doing, and I showed this, well, it's a paper that was published, and Douglas Alencar in Belém, he read that paper, he says, you know what, I did work for a bank and this is exactly how they do. But what I'd like to do is a paper that's more institutional. I mean, you know, I'm giving a little bit of information, but I don't really give a lot of information on that. You know, but this might be, for example, in terms of sales to costs or different metrics, different ratios of how the company's performing, salaries relative to revenues generated. And that's what I'd like to do in the new paper, is give more definite criteria or definitions of this and proof of how that changes through the cycle. Because I know it gets more difficult to borrow or easier to borrow. We know that. I saw the numbers. So yeah, I think this sort of is a micro theory of banks and lending, and this is sort of like the new stuff. You know, I haven't seen anyone use that sort of approach before. But it's certainly based on Keynes, the burst of optimism and pessimism, and the relative optimism and pessimism of bank borrowers and of banks. And Basel sort of says that commercial bank loan officers must assure that loan requests meet the bank's income and asset collateral requirements. Those minimum, right? Income and asset collateral requirements, these are metrics, these are ratios of this to that, the collateral of the firm versus, okay? They must in general satisfy themselves as to the creditworthiness of the project and of the firm and the character of the borrower. It is precisely for these reasons that banks develop client relationships with their borrowers. Okay? That was the quote that that inspired me to write that paper. You know, so Basel says that in one paragraph. Banks must assure themselves that you meet their requirements. So this is sort of, their requirements are based on the business cycle. Do you meet those? And that goes up and down through the cycle. And then if you meet that, you want to make sure that you meet the project is sound, and that's the micro. And then if you meet the criteria of the bank, if you meet the criteria of the bank, which is based on the macro uncertainty, you get a loan. At which interest rate? That depends on the macro uncertainty. The interest rate that she would get for a loan would be much probably lower than mine. And mine would be much lower than yours. Maybe you need to get your father, your mother, your parents to sign for you. I know that when I borrowed money when I was, can't remember, to buy a car, back when I was 20 years old, I could have gotten the loan but at a much higher interest rate. But if my father signed, the interest rate was much lower. Because my father met the criteria much more. He was that and much more. So this is, for me, the interpretation of Kaletsky's principle of increasing risk. The more creditworthy you are, the lesser your rate of interest. You meet the criteria, fine, but you're a little bit riskier. And therefore, your interest rate on your loan will be a little bit higher. So that's the sort of micro theory of bank lending. If anyone is interested in that, I think I will be doing a little symposium, maybe 3-4 papers. Look for the call, ask your professors. She'll see it for sure, and maybe you want to work on it. Okay, so we've done endogenous money, and we've done the revolutionary theory, what that means, and we've done micro theory back then. Okay, banks are special. Rejection of savings law, and you can finance your production, go through the bank, you get money, you pay wages, and there you go. Money is adoption. So nature linked to that. Okay. There was a big debate within post-Keynesian economics. Huge debate. Huge. It lasted 20 years. And it was, so the first version, the original version, Kaldor, Moore, was the horizontalist view. And that made a lot of people uncomfortable. Minsky argued that horizontalists are simpletons. Do you know what simpletons are? Simple people, not very intelligent. Stephen Rousseau called it political, Cottrell radical. I called it revolutionary, but Cottrell called it radical. Ray called it extreme. Cottrell argued that the Kaldor-Moore view, banks are passive. They simply give out money to anyone who asks. And so the article that I wrote about micro theory of bank lending was in response to a lot of this criticism. Directly in response to this criticism. And in my article, these quotes are taken from my article. I start by saying, these post-Keynesians have, said this, it's just not true. And in the article I go, it's not true because Basil, I just showed you a quote, and there are other quotes I think coming up where Basil says, we don't lend to everybody. Banks are very picky. You got to be creditworthy, and you got to be. Anyways, that's what happens when people don't read the literature carefully. So that led to a big debate. So the original version of endogenous money was the horizontalist view. Then came the structuralist Now, structuralism is not in the same sense as the macro-structuralist view of Latin America. Okay. So, anyways, so that led to a big debate, and I think the debate ended pretty much with my book in 1999, a book that Lavoie said was best book in monetary theory in the last 30 years. So it had pretty much ended there. And I think it's because partly everything had been said. This book sort of summarized the debate. There's a part called Setting the Record Straight. And I go through all the literature and I said, all these accusations of the structuralists, just not true. Today I would call them Trumpian. It's just people didn't read carefully Basil Moore, didn't quite read Nicholas Kaldor, didn't quite read carefully Mark Lavoie, you know. So, you know, it was just a question of people just not reading attentively. And so, do banks fully accommodate the demand for credit? And this is, you know, Dow and Dow. It surely cannot be suggested that credit is fully accommodating to the extent that no potential borrower is ever refused credit. False. I showed you a quote by Basil. And so a lot of this debate was for nothing, I think. Randy Ray said the same thing. And interestingly enough, Randy has come full circle. He's now a full convinced horizontalist. But at the time, he was not. And so Basil's book, and there was some debate between Basil and a few people going up to the book that discussed this. And the other discussion was, structuralists were saying, no, commercial banks don't meet all the demand for credit. And the other was, central banks don't meet all of the demand for reserves. They will often deny reserves. And we've argued, well, if they do that, what happens is the interest rates go up. If they don't meet all the demand for reserves, that means they're not putting as much money into the system, and that leads to an increase in market rates. Which we would then argue they would need to neutralize if they don't want rates to increase. And in a lot of the central bank literature, for example, the word neutralization is used a lot. They will admit that central banks neutralize the flows in and out of the financial system.
Or sterilize.
Sterilization. Perfect. Absolutely. And they recognize this. Yeah? I remember when I was writing my dissertation back in 1996 or so, I had left the New School. I was in the New School for 2 years for my courses. Then I went back to Canada to write my dissertation. New School has a reputation of people taking 10 years to write the dissertation. So I went back, and I remember meeting people at the Bank of Canada. And I was talking to them about my dissertation and the ideas. They might not have known what endogenous money meant, but they understood what I was saying. And sterilization. And I was amazed at how much they knew from an institutional setting. The people that are doing the day-to-day, and that's why I'm not surprised, Ulrich Beinsel, that I mentioned a few times, he was the director of implementation for the ECB. And we would call him a horizontalist. Okay? So I was quite surprised, because I always figured, central banks are mainstream, and they are. I think those who make decisions, I think people might have understood what I was saying, but it was difficult for them to let go of the idea of inflation. Okay. And these are just a little bit more quotes. And so the debate was about, and so if the central bank doesn't accommodate, it risks a crisis. Banks need liquidity. And so the argument that, oh, a central bank may not fully accommodate, I think it's a wrong argument. So I think that's why Basel says, of course they accommodate, because they rank the supportive responsibility of the central banks above anything else. Again, that's why central banks were created.
Yes, I called that in a paper, full endogeneity.
Yeah.
It's endogenous at the level of banks, non-banks, banks, and it's endogenous at the level of banks and central bank also.
The two poles of endogeneity. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, or else you're going to generate a crisis. Again, we know what happened when the banks in Europe froze. Interbank market froze. The same thing in the United States. The central bank gave billions of dollars to make sure the system kept operating. The end.
Yeah.